But it's time to return to Holyrood now to hear from some MSPs. We're joined, first of all, by Tom Arthur from the SNP and Adam Tompkins from the Conservatives. Well, Adam Tompkins, this thing about the referendum bill, are you now happy with this compromise, or are you still worried?
No, I'm not happy with the referendums bill at all. I mean, the referendums bill the government is doing as if the referendums bill is about referendums in general. We all know it's not. It's a paving bill for an unwanted second independence referendum that Nicola Sturgeon is trying to ram through the Scottish Parliament at breakneck speed, and at the same time her ministers are trying to rig the rules of that referendum. And Mike Russell has moved on some of these issues, but not on all of them. He's still seeking to bypass the independent statutory role of the Electoral Commission. And we've got very simple procedures for running referendums in the United Kingdom. Ministers propose questions. The Electoral Commission assesses the intelligibility of those questions, and then Parliament decides whether to have a referendum on that question or not. Mike Russell is going out of his way to seek to bypass the independent statutory role of the Electoral Commission because he's trying not only to fast-track an unwanted second independence referendum, but to rig the rules of an unwanted second independence referendum.
This business about the question, as I understand it, at least in the current Parliament, the same question as 2014 could be used if Parliament votes for it after consultation with the Electoral Commission. Is that right?
Yeah, which means that the Electoral Commission is completely denied any opportunity to learn any lessons from the experience of how the 2014 campaign ran. Look, we know much more about running referendums and about referendum campaigns now than we did before the 2014 and indeed the 2016 referendums on independence and the European Union respectively. And it just seems to me to be bonkers for the SNP to be seeking to go out of their way to seek to ensure that the Electoral Commission could not learn the lessons and teach us the lessons that are there to be learned from the experience of 2014 and 2016.
But the counter to that is they've still got to be consulted. And should they, as they have so far, made very public, let's say they made public that they didn't like the 2014 question being put again, and even though formally Parliament could decide to do it, Parliament would be in a difficult position, wouldn't it?
Parliament will do what the SNP tells it to do, because Patrick Harvey, who controls Patrick Harvey and the Greens and the SNP together have a majority, unfortunately, in this place, at least until the next election. And Patrick Harvey is, as we all know, a very cheap date. He's a very cheap date when it comes to the budget. He'll be an even cheaper date when it comes to IndyRef2. There will be a majority here that Nicola Sturgeon can control. And we have to stop. We have to stop this. We have to stop IndyRef2 being rammed through this Parliament. We have to stop the SNP's attempts, which have not stopped yet.
Okay.
We have to stop the SNP's attempts to rig the rules.
Tom Arthur, what's the response to that? I mean, what is wrong with what Adam Tompkins is saying, which is that you should have normal procedure. If you want a referendum, you give the question to the Electoral Commission, allow them to make a ruling on it, and then do that. What's wrong with that?
Well, that is the scenario. There can only be a reuse of a previous question in this Parliament if Parliament votes for it. And Parliament, as democratically elected by the Scottish people, is the best vehicle to do so. And as a consequence of amendments made to the referendums bill this morning, any future referendum on any matter, constitutional or otherwise, can only be brought about through primary legislation, in which case the issue of a question, as well as any other aspect, will be subject to full parliamentary scrutiny as provided for by the primary legislative
procedure. Right, but what
procedure.
Adam Tompkins is saying is what's being removed is the ability of the Electoral Commission to say we're not happy with this, and that to have force, because in theory the Electoral Commission, even if it made its opposition to a particular question public, it would be Parliament that could overrule them.
Yes, but as the Electoral Commission conceded in evidence at stage 1 of the referendums bill, ultimately is a decision for Parliament. Parliament cannot be bound by any body, and it is a decision for Parliament to take. Yes, it will take into account the advice of the Electoral Commission and any other relevant body in evidence it receives, and there will be an avenue for that evidence to be fed into Parliament through the primary legislative process for any future referendum. But the reality is that it is a decision for Parliament to take, and that is something that ultimately the Electoral Commission themselves recognise.
Well, isn't that right, Adam Tompkins?
No, I'm afraid it's not right. I mean, let's try and understand why this matters, right? It matters because the Electoral Commission, created by statute, is an independent body whose job is very simple. Their job is to put the interests of voters first and to make sure that the interests of voters are the paramount consideration here. What Mike Russell and Nicola Sturgeon want the paramount consideration to be is convenience to the SNP. They want to load the dice. They want to bypass the independent rule regulation
but hang on, Tom
of the
Arthur's
Electoral
just
Commission.
said that the Electoral Commission themselves have accepted that the wording of a question would be, the final decision on that would be the decision of Parliament.
But Parliament, that's exactly the point. Parliament should make the decision on the basis of the independent advice of the Electoral Commission. Ministers propose questions. The Electoral Commission then scrutinises those proposals to make sure that the interest of voters have been put first and foremost, not the interests of any one political party, and then Parliament decides. What Mr Russell and what Nicola Sturgeon want is to railroad Parliament into a quick decision without us being able to seek the independent and expert advice of the Electoral Commission.
But they would still be consulted.
Sorry?
They would still be consulted.
Well, I'm not sure that they would be consulted, but the point is this, that the Electoral Commission should independently test each and every referendum question that's put to the people in the United Kingdom or in any part of the United Kingdom, and there should not be any exceptions to that. It's a very simple principle, right? The 2014 independence referendum, by Nicola Sturgeon's own remarks, was the gold standard of referendums in the United Kingdom, and now she's trying to play fast and loose with the procedure and, as I say, rig the rules of a second independence referendum, which Scotland doesn't even want.
It's simply not the case. The default position is that the Electoral Commission will be consulted unless Parliament says otherwise. And as the Electoral Commission have acknowledged, the ultimate arbiter and decision maker on any question in the referendum has to be this Parliament, this democratically elected Parliament.
Okay, but Tom Arthur, you now seem to be conceding Adam Tompkins' point, because the crucial phrase there was when you said the Electoral Commission will be consulted unless Parliament decides it won't be consulted. So this compromise could mean the Electoral Commission isn't consulted. Is that correct?
That is a decision for Parliament to take.
Yeah, but hang on, that's the point that Adam Tompkins is making, is that is a complete departure from the norm.
No, because there was a process for determining the question of any future referendum which will be part of a primary legislative process. That goes through 3 stages of Parliament, which gives an opportunity for the Electoral Commission to submit evidence and to engage, just as they have engaged in the referendum bill process that is going through Parliament at the moment. So there's not an avenue blocked off. And ultimately, the decision on what the question should be is one for Parliament to take. And that is the case as things stand at the moment. Ultimately, no Parliament is bound by the Electoral Commission, and that's not changed.
No, I'm not seeking to bind Parliament to the views of the Electoral Commission. I'm seeking simply to ensure that Parliament doesn't make a decision about what the question should be in any referendum on any subject in Scotland without first seeking the independent expert advice of the Electoral Commission. Why would we want Parliament to be making bad decisions on dodgy referendum questions without first seeking the advice of the Electoral Commission? That's a question for Tom Arthur and his SNP colleagues. Why do they want to bypass the Electoral Commission? What have they got to be frightened of?
A lot of people are watching this and feeling quite confused by it, as I am. I mean, isn't the bottom line here, what it's all about is the Tories don't want another independence campaign where yes can be the answer to independence. And the SNP... I don't want
another independence referendum.
Well, I know, but the SNP don't want another one where no...
I don't want another independence referendum because we were promised in 2014 that the last independence referendum was once in a lifetime, and now they're breaking that promise as well.
The Conservatives don't want a referendum because they've been found out in their false promises in 2014. They know support for independence is growing, and they know that in a future referendum people will vote yes, and that's why they don't want one. They want to deny the people of Scotland that democratic choice.